The first thing that we can determine here is that statements B and C form a pair. Their order might be a little difficult to determine because certain words form the notion that C precedes B, but that is actually not the case. The general to specific rule comes to play here quite specifically and quite powerfully. Let's look at these statements. B tells us Marxist and socialist approaches also suggest that there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women. And then C tells us socialist writers have long argued that working men and women should work together as comrades to create a socialist society in which all forms of subordination will be removed. Now, the pairing of these two phrases, or the appearance of these two phrases, have long argued that this phrase seems to suggest that C is the opening statement, and then B tells us also suggest, which seems to follow C. But if we do have the pairing as CB, then we have a logical flaw, because C talks about socialist writers, and then B would following this, B would talk about Marxist and socialist approaches. But we already have the socialist approach much more specifically mentioned in C. So socialist writers have long argued. Marxist and socialist approaches also suggest. Why would we use the also here? If it were just Marxist approach, that would make sense. But socialist approach, here we have something in common between these two. So there is something of a gap in between these. There's a bit of a repetition that comes into play. The way out, the easy solution to this, we see the general to specific rule. We are talking about socialist approaches and writers. In B, we have socialist approaches. And in C, we have something more specific in socialist writers. So by general to specific, B should come first, then C. The only problem is the word also in B, but that's all right, because another aspect relating to this might have been suggested before B. Now, if we get the pair BC, we'll see that that makes perfect logical sense. Let's look at these statements in order once more. Marxist and socialist approaches also suggest that there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women. The reason behind this is given in C. Socialist writers have long argued that working men and women should work together as comrades to create a socialist society in which all forms of subordination will be removed. And hence, one could say that there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women. So the reasoning for the statement or the argument made in B is given in statement C. Thus, we find that B and C form a pair in the order BC. Now, D here is a bit of a floater, so we'll come to it last. Let's look at A first. A says the enemy against which feminists must struggle is therefore not men, but the economic system. So we see that while B and C build the premise that there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women, A brings in feminists and says that these notions or these areas, these approaches, they suggest that there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women. Thus, feminists, they don't have a struggle with men, but rather the economic system. So A is a perfect conclusion to B and C. There is one thing missing, but we'll get that relation in D once we come to D. So A follows the pair B and C. Let's keep a gap in between. We don't know where D fits yet. So now we look at statement D. It tells us the relation among sexes will no longer be debased by women's economic independence. So we find that this could come in at two places. It could come in at the beginning. It could come in before A. But before A makes sense, because here we are talking about economic independence and A is talking about the economic system. If we place D before, then we see that there are two abrupt jumps. From the aspect of economic independence, we come to Marxist and socialist approaches, and there's no direct connection. Then again, we see no longer be debased by women's economic independence. From this more specific reference, we come to no basic conflict of interest between men and women. The same way as we had decided B and C were in order, where C gave the reasoning behind this phrase, there is no basic conflict of interest between men and women, D also gives an additional reason for the very same argument. And so D has to follow B and C. D has to come immediately before A, because that would be the second jump that we talked about. If we had placed D here at the beginning, let's say, then we would first have a gap in between statements D and B, because they don't directly connect. Then we'll have a gap between statements C and A, because C still talks about socialist approach or socialist writers, and A then jumps to the economic system, which makes no sense, no immediate sense. Thus, we realize that D cannot be at the beginning. D has to be in between the pair BC and the statement A. With that, we get the sequence ready. The correct answer is BCDA.